So the next essential HTML form element is the label. Now the label is easy to write off. I've seen a lot of beginners say, it seems like it's not super necessary, but labels are really, really important in terms of accessibility and making your forms just easier to use. So here we have a checkbox, which we actually haven't seen how to create just yet. And then we have a label. Now this label does more than just visually give us some text. It also is associated with this checkbox. So they are linked behind the scenes. So if someone's using a screen reader, the screen reader knows exactly what text belongs with this. Otherwise, if a label was not used and we just had a paragraph or a span or some other text, it would be basically impossible for the screen reader to know, does this text go with that checkbox, or does this text, or how is it organized? So the label element actually associates. There's a direct connection between some input or some form control and some piece of text. Also, it's not just about enhancing this for screen readers or making a better experience for people using screen readers. It also makes the label itself clickable when we associate two elements. So I can click here to select the checkbox or to uncheck it. And that can be nice for everyone, but especially on smaller screens or people with poorer vision, it's just easier. So those are some of the reasons to use labels. We need to usually have some sort of label for our inputs, even if it's not an actual label element. You might be able to get away with, something else, a span or a paragraph, but you shouldn't, because a label gives you additional benefits. So the way we make this connection from a label to an input is by using two attributes we have not seen. One is called ID. So on an input, we give it an ID. It could be anything. It should be short and simple, but in this case, it's cheese for this one checkbox. Then we use that exact same value and we set it for the for attribute on the label. So what does this label, or what is it for? It's labeling something called cheese. And that basically matches anything that has the ID of cheese. IDs are something we'll come back to when we learn CSS in just a bit. But what you should know now is that only one element on a page should have a given ID. So cheese is supposed to be unique for this one input. We could have cheese 2 or peas or some other ID. We can do whatever we want, but we should not reuse cheese. And that's important because this is labeling exactly one input. There's one connection, cheese and cheese. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a label for this form. Let's see, what should we do? Let's pretend that this is a, I guess, what do we have? A username, a password, a color, and a number. Well, let's just go with enter a username, enter your password, or something like that. So let's do that here. We'll add our first label. So a label has an opening and closing tag. Inside, we put the text that we want to label the input with. So let's go with enter a username. Okay. And then we need to associate that label with this input. So why don't we let's do the ID first on our input. So what should the ID be? ID will be, how about just username? That's exactly what it is. It's a username input. Then here on the label, we set for equals username, and those need to match. Let's refresh. So now we have our text. Notice the label is an inline element. So if we want to break our form up, that's totally up to us. I mean, we could use divs or paragraphs or anything really to structure this. But now, as I click here, can you see that my input was focused automatically for me? That tells us they are associated. And if I change that, if I got rid of, or I just slightly misspelled something, I got rid of an E, they're no longer connected. And I click here, nothing happens. So that proves to us that they are connected. There is that link behind the scenes. So we should add a label in for each one of these. You can do that quickly. And if you use Emmet, you do label tab, it automatically adds the for attribute. So we could do password, and then let's just go with enter a password. And why don't we wrap these guys in a paragraph? So we want that to be a paragraph to start. Let's see how that looks. It looks pretty awful, but it's good enough for now. Let's do another paragraph for the password and the password label. Okay, and then let's connect them. So for equals password, we need ID equals password. That should be good enough. Let's see if they're connected. There we go. And it is a password input. Now we've got our color. Could do that too. Probably not that common to need this, but let's label it color will be the for attribute. ID needs to be color, and enter a color. Refresh. I click on this label and it is associated. It opens up the color picker. And finally, we've got our number. We'll just do a label here. For will be number. ID will be number. And lastly, our text will be enter a number. I have no idea what this form is where we need, let me associate them. Not associate them, let me group them together in this paragraph. Okay, there we go. And now we've got a lovely form that you can't submit because we don't have a button, but all the labels are set up correctly. And this is super important that you follow this pattern. So if you're just making a form quickly on your own, I can understand it's easy to skip labels, but if you're ever going to have something released to the world and deployed and you want people to use it, it's going to be in your portfolio, whatever it is, make sure your inputs are labeled correctly. Now there is one other way to label an input using the label element. It's less common, but you can do this where you actually will nest the input inside of the label. Like this right here, the input is nested inside of the label. Technically, you don't have to have the for and the ID if you do it this way. So this is a valid approach, but for some reason, it's far more standard and common to do it this way, to not nest them. And I guess it makes it easier to style things separately. This way, they're kind of implicitly linked. It's better, in my opinion, to go with this route, even though this is easier and a bit shorter. This is what I'll be using. So we use an ID and the for attribute. Labels, very important. I'll leave off at that. Let's move on. We got to talk about buttons.